Hello everyone, welcome back to the 10th edition of the annual academic conference. We begin day 3 panel sessions with queer spaces in public life moderated by Professor Abhishek Paroi from the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Madras. Let me take this opportunity to introduce to you the panelists for this morning. We begin with Aman Sinha, a master's student in English from Ambedkar University, presenting his paper titled Queering the City, Textualizing Sexual Alterity Within Modernist Fragmentations. Following him, Gargi Thilak, a doctorate scholar from the Department of English Literature, English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad, talking on a paper, When I was restricted from accessing spaces, I decided to create one. The Politics of Gender, Spatializations and Transwomen blog narratives in Malayalam. The concluding speaker of the panel will be Uddipta Roy, a master's student in developmental studies from Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Hyderabad, speaking on his paper, Eyeing at the Park, clicking on the top icon, the pandemic and the queer geographies, spatializing the sexual dissident in Kolkata. Panelists will be given 15 minutes to present the paper. Panelists who would like to present a presentation or paper to the audience, please inform your moderator and you will be given presenter access. After the completion of all panelists, the moderator will ask the questions, followed by questions from the members of the panel, followed by members of audience through the chat box. The session will conclude with the closing remarks by the moderator. The session is recorded for archival purposes. Use of derogatory or offensive languages is strictly prohibited and will attract strict actions. I now leave the floor to Professor Abhishek Paroi to moderate the panel Queer Spaces in Public Life.
Thank you very much, Medha, for a really interesting introduction. And we have 3 very interesting papers today. So without any further ado, I request Aman Sinha from Ambedkar University, Delhi, to kindly start his presentations. Aman, if you're ready, could you kindly start?
Am I audible?
Yes, you are, Aman. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, sir. Good morning, everybody. My paper is titled Queering the City, Textualizing Sexual Alterity Within Modernist Fragmentations. The emergence of queer theory as a distinct critical approach towards analyzing human relationships as operating amidst power networks vehemently critique the mainstream idea that sexuality and gender are intrinsic aspects of one's identity. Sexuality and gender as aspects of an individual's identity do not exist in a historical vacuum and operate amidst power networks that govern how identificatory processes take place in modern nation states. Inspired by this idea, theorists trying to articulate the complex relationship between sexuality and geographical spaces premised that just as gender and sexuality, spaces in their physicality as well as metaphysicality are produced from specific heterosexual lenses. Natalie Oswin, in her essay, Critical Geographies and the Uses of Sexuality, Deconstructing Queer Space, refers to John Binney, who argues, just as individual persons do not have pre-existing sexual identities, neither do spaces. In other words, space is not naturally, authentically straight, but rather actively produced and heterosexualized. So, spaces are effectively gendered and sexualized to support a monolithic and capitalist heterosexual lifestyle which operates in correspondence with power networks of modern nation states. This articulation of a critical juncture between queer studies and geography, and furthermore trying to understand the exclusionary politics that govern the construction of gay and lesbian spaces, started only towards the end of 20th century. However, the modern metropolis since the beginning of the 20th century came to be recognized as a space that enabled a certain kind of gay subculture to operate in its anonymity. The cluster of symbols and images that construct narratives of living in the countryside, as German sociologist George Simmel argues in his book The Metropolis and Mental Life, operated under the guise of tradition, carrying an aura of constancy around them. This in turn also informed the construction and perception of social ties. In the modern metropolitan space, however, the idea of immediate social contact was reconfigured. Simmel argued that the way a modern subject navigated through the violent onslaught of stimuli that keeps shifting and displacing was by creating distance to protect itself from these fluctuations. This distance was manifested in the form of rationality and reason. However, it is in these same discontinuities that a gay subculture thrived. Vast population, industrialist culture, and loosened social interaction amongst people allowed for homosexual men to form networks of contact, albeit anonymously. So meeting in bars, abandoned factory headquarters, public toilets, bathhouses, and parks in evenings after midnight was a recognized common practice. Identities acquired a performativity which could exist and thrive only within the city space through a reworking of the public. The relationship thus was and has been dialectical, while a reorganization of socio-cultural relationships within metropolitan spaces enabled gay networks of contact to form and operate. These networks also had an impact on how the space was conceived, constructed as they were to support nuclear heterosexual family units. The modern metropolis thus became an active site of reconfiguring the performative aspect of gender and sexual identities. In this paper, I will primarily focus on Andrew Holleran's novel Dancer from the Dance, published in 1978, and James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room, published in 1956. The title of the former has been taken from Yeats's 1926 poem Among School Children. The phrase appears in the last stanza of the poem in the line, "How do you know the dancer from the dance?" signifying an ideal state of unity and coherence of the self. Holleran's book is a novel within a novel. It begins in epistolary form as letters exchanging between two friends. One of them is Paul, who moved to the Deep South after intense disillusionment within the city of New York. The other, who signs each letter with a different name, stayed behind. He works as a prostitute and is also the writer of the novel Wild Swans, the story of Malone and Sutherland, who are the epicenters of the decaying cultural ethos that Holleran is trying to historicize in his narrative. The intertextual relationalities embedded within the title are of utmost significance, as they have to be contextualized within the discourse of the metropolitan space and its relationship to the gay subculture that thrived in its anonymity. On one level, there is the dialogism that Malone and Sutherland represent, with their distinct modes of self-referentiality and different modes of negotiation with the city. In her article, The Unspeakable Linguistics of Camp, linguist Shu Lee talks about how gay men in Britain manufactured secret linguistic systems to communicate with each other. They used phrases and slangs that would either go unnoticed or misunderstood and hence ignored in mainstream spaces to avoid the threat of persecution. It is these linguistic systems that eventually evolve into the aesthetics of camp, a mode of expression that is grounded in over-the-top theatricality and irony. It is a mode of spectacle, bending myths of gender and sexuality in ways that are easily identifiable. Sutherland, with his drag impersonations of chaste religious icons, finds his self-referentiality in this cultural and linguistic history. Malone, on the other hand, speaks from a sensibility that is increasingly disillusioned with the frank aesthetics of and ethics of camp behavior. In other words, his self-referentiality is grounded in a masculine sense of apathy for his deviance from the quote-unquote normative. He thinks of his sexuality as a condition, God's little joke to humble the proud, as he says. These micro-histories that influence Malone's and Sutherland's understanding of themselves manifest in the way they speak. While the former's language is grounded in anxiety and self-hatred, the latter speaks with a sense of surety which is experiential and ironical at the same time. However, there is another prominent textual voice in the narrative, the city. The city space within this discourse has to be read on two levels, both as a recurring narrative character as well as a recurring narrating voice. The writer and activist David Lewis, in his essay Dancer from the Dance, Required Reading for Gays, comments upon the incoherent narrative voice that overshadows the story of Wild Swans. He locates narrative authority not in the actual narrator, but in the city. The city isn't just a character. It acquires its own narrating voice, textualizing its importance for establishing the conditions of a culture of love and eroticism to develop amongst these men, and at the same time also marring the love from flourishing, or as the narrator hopes, providing salvation by actualizing into anything emotionally concrete. Each character, except Sutherland at one point or another, remembers how they migrated to the city, enchanted by the possibility that held for them, only to realize that there is no love in the city. One aspect of course is the idea that the modern metropolis in its conceptual and material genesis is a space that is actively produced, gendered, and heterosexualized. In other words, it was designed to anchor a heterosexually capitalist lifestyle sustained through a culture of material abundance and reproducibility. On the other hand, the queer subject's constant negotiation with it signifies a historically active queering of the space. This connotes to the larger idea of the queering of modernist aesthetics to establish a mode of expression that conveys the intricacies and efficacies of sexual alterity. Stephanie Harris, in her essay Exposures, Rilke, Photography, and the City, talks about Rainier Maria Rilke, who looks at this abundance of stimuli as an interruption to his definitive poetic sensibilities, to the point of not being able to differentiate himself from that which he is observing, the city. It is in this particular kind of modernist discontinuity that a specific kind of male homosexual desire manifests itself. Another aspect is that within the metropolitan space, a particularly mechanized version of desire is engendered to thrive. For Malone, the stimulus isn't just the city in whose dark, deserted lanes he says he wants to lose himself, but it is also the abundance. It is also the abundance of men that he is so enchanted by, and whom he knows and doesn't know at the same time. Desire, in its most corporeal manifestation, is abundantly materialized within the city to the point of being easily reproducible. Furthermore, subjects engendered within this framework of desire become increasingly replaceable. Mellon asks, can I leave Manhattan without ever leaving Manhattan? So all sense of spatiality and temporality is lost within this space. The characters are stuck in an atemporal, ahistorical limbo of contemplation and consumption, an eternal sense of exile, as it were. They aren't able to differentiate between themselves and the city that humanizes and dehumanizes them simultaneously. Paul, one of the letter writers, while commenting upon Wild Swans, explaining how the city, the unreal city, the city itself was the greatest drug of all. Invoking the philosophy of George Santayana, he says, artists are unhappy because they are not interested in happiness. They live for beauty. God, was that steaming, loathsome city beautiful? And why finally no human lover was possible? Because I was in love with all men, with the city itself. Thus, the city is conceived in a paradox, and it is in this paradoxical conception that the homosexual subject becomes the city. In this conception of desire, the traditional grammar of the self, which arrives at meaning through the strict opposition between the subject and object, collapses. The question isn't anymore, how do you know the dancer from the dance? The question becomes, how does the queer subject know himself from the city? Giovanni's Room, set in 1950s Paris, tells the story of David, who grew up in America. He migrates to France to escape the pressures of his family and his father's hope to actualize the American dream he has nurtured him with, a stable job and a timely marriage and a relentless pursuit of success and uplift. In Paris, away from his girlfriend Hella, David is free to explore the dark cavern, within quotes, that had opened up inside him after his first sexual encounter with a man. His relationship with Giovanni suffers similar woes, as David can't let go of the anxieties of not being able to escape the cavern, and the anxieties that come as a result of not wanting to either. The cavern signifies both his desire for Giovanni as well as the city that actively becomes the site onto which that desire is projected. As Giovanni's life descends into catastrophe, David reflects on why he migrated to Paris at all and the impossibility of leaving the city hereon. Throughout the novel, this reflection of the inescapability of desire is projected upon the city. That is the lens from which David understands his temporal and spatial location. The dark cavern of desire echoes a similar sense of spatial precariousness of the area in which Giovanni's room is situated, behind the, within quotes, massive, respectable, and fairly recent buildings. The street ends in a small park, and the room is situated ahead of the vestibule and the short, dark corridor. I only made out the lines of clutter and disorder, says David. His anxieties fragment into dismay and relief simultaneously as he enters Giovanni's room. This echoes a similar sense of fragmentation and paradox that is noticed in Mellon's negotiation with the city. Furthermore, David remembers his life in the room and invades his location in Paris as devoid from any temporality, a kind of limbo, a sense of being stuck in the present, trapped in the contemplation of escape. David's sense of exile as an inevitable part of his condition is strikingly similar to that of Malon's. Moreover, the genesis of hate that he feels for Giovanni is nurtured by the same roots as that of his love for him. One day, while walking with him, David finds himself sexually attracted to another man who looks like Giovanni. He realizes that within the city, his desire for Giovanni is so easily reproducible for another man, and this realization traumatizes David into ending his relationship with him. Giovanni and the man who looks like him constantly remind David of the inexorableness of his desire, as well as the inescapability of the city. He says, with this fearful intimation, there opened in me a hatred for Giovanni, which was powerful as my love for him, and which was nourished by the same roots. A similar version of desire is represented here as something that causes anxiety because of its continuous reproducibility.
Aman, if you could just wind up another 3 minutes, that would be great.
Yeah, sir. I'm just going to. Thank you.
Yeah, don't rush. Yeah. Please take time. Don't rush.
Yeah. This archetypal relationship between sexuality and space that bases itself on a kind of queering of modernist aesthetics is present in a lot of gay-themed fiction that was written before the AIDS epidemic in 1981. It is a very queer interruption in the idea of self, which foregrounds itself within the discourse of the city as a fragmentary space. The lines between the subject, Malone/David, and the object, New York/Paris, are eternally blurred. They both come into being dialectically. The separation between who the subject is and what the subject does is integral to the construction and exclusion of queer presences from the public space. The dialectical merging, thus, an intense collapse of identity and action between the subject and the city is also a means to disrupt that erasure and mark the sense of visibility while negotiating with the metropolis. However, this dialect is not divorced from relations of power. One cannot assume the emergence of a gay subculture as a smooth countercultural discourse to heteronormativity and oppression. Even this historically active queering is not entirely external to the structures of power it attempts to subvert in the first place. It is reproduced within the same networks of race, class, gender, and politics of migration, etc. This queering, as it is presented within Holleran's and Baldwin's books, is mostly performed by white cisgender men who have enough capital to move around the city and access its queered sections. In other words, this interruption in the idea of self echoes the same relations of power that establishes the conditions that essentialize heterosexuality as default or normative. Spaces and the economies of desire that operate within them are not just gendered and heterosexualized, but also racialized and class-marked. The question of queer performativity, thus, should not be contextualized solely within the discourse of identity. It needs to move beyond mere identity politics and not essentialize a mode of expression as a fixed or a universal point of reference that subsumes the complex and ever-shifting ways in which different subjects access and navigate spaces. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Aman. That was really interesting. I really enjoyed the paper, and I have a couple of questions which I will address to you at the end. But it's a really loaded paper and very well researched as well, and very elegantly written as well. I loved listening to you. So we'll quickly move on to Gargi Thilak from FU Hyderabad. So Gargi, if you're ready, could you kindly start your presentation?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Regarding all titles, when I was restricted my spaces, I decided to create one: the politics of gender specializations. The politics of gender, spatializations, and transwomen blog narratives in Malayalam. The debates on spatiality intend to dismantle or rewrite the notions that frame
Gargi, could you move a little closer? 1 second, Gargi, could you move a little closer to your microphone? I think it's a little bit dim, your voice. Maybe you can situate the laptop in front of you or move a little closer to the microphone.
So can you hear me now?
This is much better. Thank you so much. Much better. Please carry on.
The debates on spatiality intend to dismantle or rewrite the notions that frame identities informed by the assumptions. Here, such as Edward Sawyer and Henry Lafay attempt to study the bodies represented by or excluded from a space and the boundaries defining these spaces. Rundle, in her preface to the second chapter of Gender, Space, Architecture and Interdisciplinary Introduction, refers to Henry Lafay's illustrations on the correspondence between the physical space and social space, explaining how representation helps produce and is produced by social space. I begin the discussion on cyberspace and spatiality referring to Ken Haley's observation that networked information machines enable individuals to transmit or move a sensory experience of self sphere across virtual space. The web becomes an sad space in which one can reach out, touch, and fetishize other individuals. The private devices through which the internet could be accessed, in particular mobile phones, are now counted as one's own private space. It also stands as a mediated space through which the private domestic space conventionally attributed to women get extended to a wider virtual world that contains a large number of multidimensional private and public spaces. Like the material world, the virtual world also comprises of the spatial structures that informs one's identity formation and self-construction. The gender bifurcations in the cyberspace are often evident in types of comment, in the types of content posted, public response and comments on the post, and the degree of visibility acquired. Gender presumptions of the patriarchal mainstream public of Kerala lies in the difference in comment response that appeared in the recent so-called stylish and trendy photos posted by the 70-year-old male actor Mammootty and blatantly sexist and ageist response to the photos posted by 69-year-old female actor Rajini Chandi. The same crowd that appreciated the hard work of the male actor stridently attempted to deny the agency and sexuality of the latter. In her article, The Defense of Acharam, J. Devika observes that mere visibility on online spaces is sufficient to invite condemnation for being a feminacy, a Malayali slur word that means feminacy. The visibilization of gender has made anyone and everyone a feminist and hence open to attack. However, the individualizing nature of the online space makes it difficult to fight back collectively. Part of the problem is that the structure of the internet makes empathetic communities and compromises that comes with it unfashionable. The patriarchal construction of LGBTQ identities on cyberspaces are often dominated by offensive jokes and slur words. It was to such a misogynistic space, Heidi Sadia, a trans woman broadcast journalist, launched the first transgender vlog in Malayalam titled Heidi Sadia, also known as Heidi Other Vlogs, in 2019. The first part in the title of my paper constitutes Heidi's statement on what caused her to start vlogging. She says, I quote, "When I was accessing spaces, I created one. Sadia reveals that she had longed for a space where her versions could be well put together. So being a journalist, she insists on the importance for having an independent platform for transgenders to produce and alternate discussions on their transgender food. Her vlog and the vlogs of other trans women that follow portray their own life stories in their spaces, delivering authentic narratives. This paper categorizes transgender vlog narratives in Malayalam as life narratives and looks at how these oral or visual self-narrative forms are different from its. Although talking about the self is a transcultural practice, the lack of a clearly defined and established autobiographical genre evinces the lack of much commonalities among these narratives. The vlogs discussed in this paper, the oral talking about oneself and one's everyday life, constitute a matrix of fragmented and ever-evolving autobiographical narrations. And paved way for the birth of many other new genres of narratives, which could be called tertiary orality or post-secondary orality. Video blogs discussed in this paper belong to tertiary orality, which includes the digital self-narrations. Inokinchi Krekin on digital life narratives quotes Philip Legum's definition of traditional autobiography as retrospective prose narrative written by a real person concerning his own existence. Unlike these traditional autobiographies, the digital self-narratives are usually non-retrospective and are the commodities owned by new media corporate companies like YouTube or Facebook. Digital life narratives produced fragmentally on these platforms appears to be highly interactive as the audience are open to the comment section at any period of time. The immediate interactions influences the construction of later fragments of the narratives. Krecknin finds digital obsolescence as the most prominent enemy of the digital life narratives, as it permanently disrupts the process of narrative formation and sometimes the destruction of the entire narratives. Heidi's YouTube channel titled Heidi Sadia contains 277 videos and has 1.52 lakh subscribers till the date. Sadia's channel became an immediate popularity and also gave her community a visibility they were denied for years. This attempt by Sadia inspired many other transgenders to come forward with new channels. In that sense, the establishment of Sadia's channel would be a milestone in the history of digital gender revolution that deeply influenced Keralites' perception of transgender bodies. Then Seema Vineet, a successful bridal makeup artist who was also part of the comedy entertainment television shows in Malayalam, acquired further popularity when she appeared in Heidi Satya vlogs. Seema later came up with her own channel that has got 1.2 lakh subscribers and 227 videos. Seema's vlog overtly reacts against the power relations within and outside the community, including the cyber crimes against her. Trans people's virtual presence and free flow of self-speak on YouTube spaces enables possibilities for self-representation, challenging and renegotiating existing tropes of self-representation within mainstream film and media. Further, this digital presence can compensate for the marginalization and invisibility that many trans people experience, both within and outside the LGBT movements. The vlogs I discuss here centers on two kinds of spaces. First one is the heterosexual cisgendered space in which a trans woman finds herself vulnerable. The second is the spaces in which which could be accessed only by those who belong to a hijra household. The trans woman vloggers assert that they intend to blur the boundaries between these two. Mikheya, a trans woman from Kerala, narrates her life story in an episode of Dea Gayatri's vlog posted in November 2020. Content of the vlog includes Mikheya's life experience as a hijra in a hijra gharana situated in Bangalore. Mikheya, who ran away from the home at 18 and took refuge in a gharana, had lived there for 2 years and reveals that the fictive kinship system to which she was recruited to was highly hierarchical. She adds that irrespective of being surrounded by the people of same gender, she felt suffocated and trapped in the power structures of her parivar, although she felt safe in that space. Similar experiences are shared through these vlogs. Seema Vineet, in 3 of her sensational episodes, come up with strident criticism against the financial exploitation occurs in a Guru-Chala relationship within the spaces of Hijra Gharanas. Although such criticisms are prevalent, all these vloggers stress on the importance to preserve this familial system with a restructuring of the power equations within. They believe that these gharanas constitute the safest shelter homes for a transgender. Also, the gharana is a marginal space. When I say margin, referring to bell hooks, I intended to call it as a space of resistance rather than a space of despair. In the second part of the vlog, Mikheya narrates her experiences outside the gharana in the city spaces of Bangalore. She recollects that within the city space, she could access only 4 major public spaces that includes traffic signals, trains, street shops, and the auspicious spaces of wedding. All these spaces represent the limited choices of occupations a hijra could undertake in that city. She says, I quote, if you go there, you will have only 3 options to earn a livelihood: begging, sex work, and badai. Nobody would give or let you do another work, unquote. transgender vlogs have contributed extensively to a reconsideration of conventional distinctions between political and private life. While fighting for the political recognition of what has been historically to the private sphere, queer theorists such as Lauren Berland have also warned against mass culture's depoliticization of the social through privatization of the public sphere. According to Berland, I quote, "The political sphere, our arena of citizenship's enactment, has displaced in favor of an intimate public sphere, individualizing experiences of social hierarchy and threatening to turn pain into banality." Unquote. The trans vlogs enter into this contentious intimate public by pinpointing the city as a space of struggle and specifying the juridical, social, and psychological obstacles that this particular group is confined with. The vlogs tap into a mainstream Malayalam media culture filled with effective personal stories, but they do so in order to debate how the personal is political. The vloggers here attempt to dismantle the conceptual boundaries of Hijra household space, making it accessible to cisgender heterosexual public. After Hadi's vlog on the Varsha Puja ceremony of Seema Vineet, after Hadi's vlog on the Varsha Puja ceremony of Seema Vineet acquired a wide range of popularity, Seema invited the cisgender public for Vaishnavi's Jalsa, which took place in the Tanjavur Ammamadam, Thiruvananthapuram. As documentary and LGBT studies scholar Roger Hellas warns, behind the promise of cultural visibility and voice for any marginalized group hovers the potential threat that is publicized bodies merely become a confessional or sentimental spectacle. This observation of Hellas is justified when Heidi Sadia refers to the renowned documentary on her life titled Avan Valarnu Avanai, and says that even the story of her own life was very sentimental. These vlogs work together to bring about an alternate perception of trans bodies. The participatory culture of YouTube and other social media platforms allow the viewers to comment and respond to the narrative stories postponed. The comment section of these vlogs testifies the transformation took place in the perception of gender variance that makes the vlog a space of irrevocable resistance towards the misogynistic forces in the cyberspace and material space. These vlogs are a successful, resilient collective effort to intervene and negotiate dominant public spaces that often demonize, victimize, or pathologize the trans bodies. The vloggers seem deliberately and persistently talk about the way out of pathologization, resisting and renegotiating the offered subject position. That's it. I have concluded the paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gargi. That was really interesting. I was particularly impressed with the way you took a very complex theoretical model and applied that to some very real and relevant social examples. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions about spatiality and agency. I'll have a couple of questions for you as well, but thank you. That was a really interesting presentation. So we'll quickly move on to the final presentation in the panel, which sounds equally interesting. This is Uddipta Roy from DoHSS Hyderabad. So Uddipta, if you're ready, could you kindly start your presentation?
Sir, am I audible?
You are audible. Please go ahead.
Yes. Thank you. So first, I would like to bring to your notice that when I was rereading the paper that I had submitted for this conference, I realized that my argument was a bit ill-arranged. I regret the inconvenience of the reader if at all my written paper has been circulated, and I would attempt to undo some of the confusions that might have arisen. My request to you would be to forgive the center for this and look at the paper as critically as I'm trying my writing presentation. Primitive work in the space of the sexuality in urban spaces been marked by the separation of homosexuality in the this ghettoization has been often understood through facial strategies of minorities to segregate themselves from hegemonic spaces. As Peter Jackson notes, the gay and the lesbian communities have their own distinctive universe of discourse, which provides a means of entry to their social world and to its spatial constitution. Space itself, therefore, becomes politically subversive. However, lesbian women do not exercise such a choice of ghettoization, according to Jackson, due to their dual political commitment of the lesbian women towards sexual liberation, as well as the feminist agenda against patriarchy. Therefore, and as well as their positional similarity to heterosexual women in terms of their subjugation to patriarchy in multiple forms, which also includes, according to Jackson, inaccess to private property. In this context, I must mention that the paper submitted due to some error had the citation of Jackson and Lloyd's work missing, and hence to provide clarity, the texts I'm referring to here are the chapter on gender and sexuality in Peter Jackson's Maps of Meaning, an Introduction to Cultural Geography, published in 1989, and Lloyd's paper, The Prosperity of San Francisco's Gay Neighborhood, presented at an annual meeting of the Association of American Geographers at San Antonio, Texas in 1982. Natalia Oswin had pointed out that space theory demarcated the contours of a bias towards heteropatriarchal in the epistemological understanding of spaces. In doing so, they have significantly tried to relocate queer spaces situated at the margins like that of resistance to the heteronorm. She therefore intends to write against this division of spaces and for a queer theory that accommodates various processes that interact simultaneously to shape up the operations of power through a deconstruction of the hetero-homo binary. This enables one to understand the complexities through which sexuality shapes itself, as well as conceptions of race, class, and gender, along with itself in a concerted process. Paul Boyce, in a more closer to home work on male-to-male sexual spaces in Kolkata, suggests, rather departing from earlier works, that male-to-male sexualities play out in the context of a broader social framework.
Uddipta, your voice just dimmed a bit. Can you come a bit closer to the microphone?
Sure, sir.
Mm.
Is this better?
Slightly better. It was perfect initially, but it just dimmed a little bit. Can you try one more time?
Yeah. So, is this any better now?
It is better. It's audible. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah. So, Paul Boyce, in a more closer to home work on male-to-male sexual spaces in Kolkata, suggests, rather departing from earlier works, that male-to-male sexualities play out in the context of a broader social framework within the geographical spaces which have discursively heteronormative meanings attached to them. Here, he contends the reading of heteronormative space as one that encompasses all and marginalizes dissident spaces by pushing them to the periphery. Role to heteronormativity, and that somehow non-normative or social homosexual spaces exist at the margins of what is permissible by the heteronorm. It reinforces the idea that things non-normative practices are not captured by the heteronormative lens, they are somewhere outside their view, or in other words, in marginal locations. In this context, R. Raj Rao draws attention to perverse spaces in the Indian context. For instance, Gents washroom, which is literally the space for the most transgressive of acts performed with hardly any pretense surrounding it. The washrooms at Shialda station or in Curzon Park in Esplanade are perfect examples from Kolkata. In fact, blogger Aninda Shankar Das brings out quite eloquently the queer spatial negotiations of the washrooms in Kolkata. Through multiple narratives that converge on letting loose at the public toilet, Das describes the sense of fear and the ways in which a different reading of space alters the way in which one navigates them. As one character mentions, and here I quote, "And then, as I adjusted to the light, I saw a grotesque shape to my right, in the shadows. It had 4 hands and a withering body. It was my monster, my curse let loose. I froze. The next moment came to define my immediate life to come. The monster uncoiled itself into 2 young men. My entry had interrupted them, but when they understood I was harmless, the kissing slowly resumed. As I realized that the only monster that existed was in my head, I stood at my urinal transfixed in terror and excitement. Once the demon, as the inhibiting force, went away, Das's character could now just see through and also reread the washroom as a space of transgressive acts. This is in line with what Paul Boyce attempts to put across through the case study of Ronjit, who attempts to understand the social-sexual topography of the bus stop in Kolkata only after a situational initiation. As he became more familiar with the ways of going about through each encounter, he was infused with both excitement and transgressive desires. According to online testimonials, the first and the last compartment of the Kolkata metro stand as the ideal space for such intimate touches and gestures that can be passed on as homosocial, often categorized as superior over other public places. In fact, Rao also brings out through autoethnography how homosocial spaces like movie halls are at once highly sexual and social. In the context of Kolkata, the theatre at Shambaja provides a brilliant parallel. The 6:15 show is popular for queer, sexual, and intimate navigations at the theatre. In his other work, Whistling in the Dark, 2021 queer interviews, he identifies spaces like parks, red light areas being physical sites of queer intimacy. Another dimension of queer space that has significantly made its way into the imagination of queerness is the virtual space. In fact, Rohit K. Dasgupta, in conversation with a very popular activist from Kolkata, Pavan Dhal, notes that queerness is being constructed in India through both the virtual as well as the physical. Dasgupta further notes that new media, social networking sites, and related technologies do not exist in isolation. Rather, they are very much embedded within other social spaces. From here, I attempt to arrive at the argument of this paper. The initial of this work was envisaged on the following neat premises. The retraction from physical interaction might have effectively left the digital queer platforms as the only major and were largely intimacy. In his essay of Other Spaces, Utopias and Heterotopias, Michel Foucault presents a complex understanding of space through his ideation of heterotopias. Calling his times as the epoch of space of simultaneity and position, he moves on to elucidate the importance of space in the Western epistemological transformation. The presupposed hypothesis of diminished space and the radically virtual space even during the pandemic can be problematized to a certain extent by comparing this to what Foucault calls a pre-Galilean tendency to form spaces of emplacement, what he calls hierarchic ensemble of places. For the work on queer heterotopias, one can imagine both virtual and physical spaces as heterotopic in nature. Jones notes queer heterotopias as spaces that are real and transgressive. In the Foucauldian sense, heterotopia is not a complete separation or departure from utopia, as is understood by some of the scholars that I was going through while attempting to structure this paper. The heterotopic, according to Foucault, are real sites, a kind of effectively enacted utopia. The real is then not only the supreme in heterotopia, the real is both inhabited and challenged, accepted and transgressed. This paper tends to argue that it is precisely because spaces in the context of Kolkata operate, queer spaces within the context of Kolkata operate within a broader social frameworks, they are heterotopic insofar as they are real and yet not be utopic. For instance, the public toilet is real as long as Das's character is haunted by demons. In fact, it is still real as a public washroom where sexual intimacies might take place. But ironically, the bliss at the vaporization of the demon indicates an epiphany characteristic of the transgressive. Foucault notes in his sixth principle on heterotopias that heterotopias have the attribute of giving birth to another real space that is as perfect as ours is not. Here, I place one case study from a number of interviews I have conducted over telephone calls. It is important to note that by queer in this paper, I have attempted to keep the boundaries as open as possible by using the queer as inevitably or potentially the transgressive. That is, to be queer, at least according to this paper, is to be the sexually dissident and hence refer to all identities, expressions, and desires that deviate even at certain instances from cis heteronormativity. The case study I present here is of Anirudh, who is 24 years old. He navigates the digital platform in search of intimate partners, sexual encounters, and casual friendships. He does not prefer meeting people too often and mostly never in popular cruising spots since he isn't well aware of them mostly due to his disinterest. Before the pandemic, he would mostly use social media as a navigational space to get hookups or casual meetups and then go on to meet his virtual mates over a long walk or maybe at a cafe. The pandemic didn't alter much, though it did reduce the number of people he met up after the initial chat over the internet. Quite surprisingly, Anirudh noted that in fact, the conversations during the pandemic had turned more sexual over the internet, and his partners were extremely interested to meet up even during the pandemic. Indeed, a click on the tap icon in Grindr can open up possibilities, but in this case, they are not very distinct from the possibilities presented otherwise. Indeed, a virtual application for Anirudh creates as much of that neural space as does the metro compartment for the dissident commute. Note has to make purification. Or one must shed the inhibition through initiation, through rereading of the space. As for instance, boys case in queer social media space, specific reference LG Britain's word Grindr, surveying and locating happiness. Drawing from of space and power, this work examines how Grindr is altering space-time of sexual relationship in ways users signify or survey their sexuality. Heterotopic spaces of otherness is able to surpass the limits of Victorian ideology by liberating sex from the confines of the home. Anirudh's case is therefore not of preference of one space over the other, that is, the preference of the physical space over the virtual during pandemic, but it is a heterotopic dwelling into the possibilities of projecting the utopic onto the real, of mapping transgressive, subversive desires that are played out in the spaces of interaction and subsequent meetup, both of which at least temporarily connote real spaces. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Uddipta. That was, again, very, very interesting. And I'm very impressed with the way all three of you managed to take very complex theoretical models and apply that to textual spaces, ethnographic spaces, visual spaces. So it's fascinating. And of course, I learned a lot from each of the papers. So we'll open up the floor for questions now. If someone has any question, you can type directly in the chat box, or you can just unmute yourself and address those to the speakers. Does anyone have any question? Please go ahead. Yeah, if I could just sort of set the ball rolling by asking the first very quick questions to the speakers. So Aman, can you hear me, Aman? Hello? Aman, can you hear me?
I can hear you, sir. Please go ahead.
Okay, great. So I really enjoyed your paper, and I love the way in which you talked about, I mean, essentially, in a way, your paper is quite modernist in quality. There's a sort of very modernist quality about the city. It's a 20th century phenomenon. But what also emerges, and you bring in George Simmel, who defined modernity as a nervous condition. Right, so it's a very interesting relationship between the sort of nerve fibers of the body and the roads of the city. And of course, the body and the city are also connected in terms of exhaustibility, in terms of mappability, etc. So the city almost becomes an organic quality in Simmel's study, which is something that you mentioned. And I think that really contributes richly to the theoretical dimension of your paper. But I was wondering, I mean, there's one little section where I was fascinated in terms of how you look at not just spatial mapping, but also linguistic mapping, right? So how people sort of invent certain codes in order to communicate to each other, just so to stay safe. At the same time, it is subversive. It is outside the parameters of sort of normative language. But at the same time, it is also protecting them from any kind of penalty, linguistic penalty. So I was wondering if you could throw a little bit more light on this idea of space and linguistic encoding, how people communicate to each other in certain spaces, inventing certain sort of coded exchanges. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? Because I was fascinated by that.
Thank you for the question, sir. So I referred to this linguist called Shuli, who talked about this idea of how um, so basically, like if you historically look at the queer movement in Britain, and in America as well, in the 1950s there was this homophile movement which kind of you know developed, and that the idea of that homophile movement was basically to sort of um, like avoid persecution by uh, not transgressing enough in a way. Um, so I connect the idea of the language and the recognition of identity in a public space through language to that, where there are certain codes and practices and lexicons which operate in the public space, but within the guise of the private, that are not then recognized by other normative, more um, accessing presences, which then protects them from the threat of being persecuted, being identified. Because this idea of and all the other two panelists also talked about the idea of visibility. The idea of visibility is a sort of it's a very dubious sort of idea because um, different people can and even self sort of willingly want to access different levels of visibility, right? For some people, if visibility is something which kind of propels them towards a certain kind of liberation politics, for a lot of people, it's also visibility itself that persecutes them, that leads them to, um, being identified as the dissident, as Uddipta said in his paper. Um, so yeah, basically that. So that there are certain these. I mean, I don't exactly remember what lexicon which which Shuli mentioned in the article, but I can send the link in of the article in the chat box if that would work. But
Yeah.
the idea basically is this: that different people are got different kinds of visibilities. They can afford, they want to access different kinds of visibility. Visibility is not something which is universally present to everybody, to every kind of subjectivity and every kind of performativity. So yeah, I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very, very interesting because again, it comes to the question of encoding, right? The city is a very coded space. There are rituals around the city, and at the same time, there are sort of coded communication as well. Every city will have its own coded communication in a very semiotic way. Even the traffic signal is coded communication in the city. So, what I was fascinated by in your discussion is that how there seems to be an effort to manufacture an alternative code which will protect certain inhabitants of the city, which will sort of have some kind of a alternative lexicon, which can survive and and still not get penalized. And as you very correctly pointed out, visibility is very complex, ontological as well as an experiential category, right? Visibility is not necessarily liberation in all situations, and that is something which is again the linguistic protection can come in a very interesting way. So I would be keen to learn more from you on this subsequently. So Gargi, if I could quickly ask you a question. I mean, again, very, very interesting in terms of how you use very complex theoretical model. You mentioned Pollock, you mentioned Derrida, you talk about liminality. But there's one term that I really wanted to pick up a little bit on, and that is secondary orality. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? Because I'm not aware of that term. I would be keen to learn what that means.
Sir, actually, secondary. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are. Please go ahead.
Secondary orality is a term coined by the theorist of oral literature. His name is Walter G. Ong. So secondary orality basically means, I think for explaining what is secondary orality, I should talk about what is primary orality. Like in ancient, in primitive cultures especially, the oral narratives, especially the self-narrative forms, the autobiographical forms were mostly in narrative forms. It was in oral forms. So it was not been recorded anywhere. Like there was no print form available at that time. So those are called primary orality. And when it comes to the print form or the written form, or any such mode, it is called secondary orality. And here I'm talking about the another section. I mean, the next stage of that tertiary orality, when when the technological advancement, the advancements in technology happens, and internet gets introduced, we are getting tertiary oralities there. But the thing is, see, when they say tertiary orality, that actually refers to the written narratives in internet, like emails or the prose narratives in internet. And for vlog narratives, actually there is no term coined as such. We can call it visual narrative or something like that. But in terms of orality, no terms have been coined till now. But I was calling it something like post-secondary orality or an advanced tertiary orality, something like that. Does that answer your question? Sir, you are not audible, sir. You have muted yourself.
Yeah, I'm so sorry for that. I'm still learning technology. Every day is a new technology for all of us. Yeah, but it doesn't answer my question. And I think what's interesting is how you historicize it, and then of course see how it has evolved. If I could quickly ask another question to you, Gargi, because I'm not aware of. Obviously, I'm not aware of Malayalam mainstream cinema, and this is something I've learned from you. But I was wondering, how do these vlogs, which are very subversive and transgressive in quality, how do they situate themselves apropos of mainstream Malayali entertainment? Do they sort of mimic that? Do they draw on that? Or is that a straightforward critique? How do they situate themselves? Do they draw on popular culture? Do they draw on popular actors and events?
Not like that. Actually, they mainly talk about their experiences, their life narratives, and try to frame an alternative discourse. And also, they try to comment on certain, mainstream Malayalam movies or other TV shows that have, earlier been celebrated so much by the mainstream heterosexual cisgender community of Malayalam. For example, there was one episode. One episode posted by Surya Isha, the blogger. So she talks about the movie Chandaputtu, acted by one of the popular actor of Malayalam, Dilip. How that character has, you know, has how that character made her feel very, humiliative. Like how, later how in her life humiliated, by the people surrounded her in the schools and in the society or even in her family. How did they use that particular term as a slur word to, abuse her in her life? So they comes up and start sharing such, experiences, like how this kind of mainstream narratives have, abused them, in that way. How they have, like, what all the how the mental, uh, what all the mental, traumas or humiliations they have undergone following these mainstream narratives. They comes up and they try to critique it.
Right. So it was an effort to deconstruct that. Yeah, that's what I guessed as well. Thank you. That was very interesting. If I could just quickly move on to Uddipta, again, fascinating presentation. And the way you sort of looking at certain liminal locations in that city, the railway toilets, for instance, the cinema halls and certain hours of the day, which are very interesting. But I was wondering, this is probably not directly related to the academic scope of your paper. You seem to use, in terms of talking about a city, you use the word Calcutta sometimes and Kolkata on certain other occasions. And there's a temporal and cultural difference. So I was wondering if there was any politics behind the usage of the word Calcutta, because that would connote a different kind of culture, say from a more neoliberal Kolkata with shopping malls. So I was wondering if that's a deliberate thing or is it something just happened?
So I was trying to kind of constitute both of these ideas in building up of the city, because I somehow believe that these are not separate categories or separate kinds of worlds that they represent. They also kind of exist in simultaneity. So and moreover, I kind of also use these words alternatively while representing the works of scholars who have worked in this domain. So for example, Paul Boyce has specifically used Calcutta to represent
Right.
a certain kind of a cultural idea. So in order to bring in his argument, I have kept it to Calcutta.
Right. Makes sense. And I was also wondering, because I haven't been to the city for a while, so I'm not very switched on. But I'm aware that there are certain cafes which have come up in the last few years. There's one particular place called Amra Adbhut, I'm aware of, and that sort of seems to define itself as an LGBT cafe, right? And that's again something which has happened in very recent times. It's a post-Kolkata phenomenon, post-new liberal phenomenon, right? So I was wondering, how would you locate this sort of movement from neoliberalism apropos of the gay and lesbian public spaces in that city? Is there a connection that you can see?
Probably I have not explored that part well in my paper, and I would, really look forward to it. But in the context of,
Your voice is breaking again, Uddipta. Yeah.
Context of yeah, am I?
Yeah, it's better.
Is it better
Perfect.
now?
It's perfect now. Yes.
Yeah.
It is.
So
Please go ahead.
I could probably sum up. I could probably.
I think we lost you again, Uddipta. Can you hear me, Uddipta? Are you there?
Sir, I think Uddipta is muted.
Can you unmute yourself, Uddipta?
Hello, sir. Yeah, am I audible?
Yeah, we can just about hear you now. Yes.
Yeah, probably if I could just turn off my video, that would kind of save the bandwidth.
That
and
might
then
work.
would
Yes, that might work. Yes.
Yeah. Is this any better now?
It is better. Please go ahead.
So probably I could sum up, the locality of Amra Adbhut in the context of the argument that I was making. So if anyone has ever been to, Amra Adbhut Cafe, one would see that it's really located in one of, the what you call the normalist of lanes in Kolkata, where you would, so if you look at it, there is a biryani shop just at the opposite of the lane, and then there is an old left front party office there, and then when you enter the the lane, and then you see the building from the outside, it doesn't even look as conspicuous as probably neoliberal cafes should look, in order to kind of attract a certain kind of populace. So I would like to hear, I'd argue that the people who inhabit say, for example, the person living right next to Amra Adbhut Cafe, or for example, the people, Amra Adbhut Cafe is run by people who also live there. So it kind of, the location kind of, okay, for instance, if I give you so the Amra Adbhut Cafe doesn't open like every day, it opens on specific events. So on most of these occasions, even when the doors of the cafe are open, this cafe is also located within a broader social context of that specific area, of all the activities that are happening within that area or surrounding that area, of all the kind of political, social interactions that are taking place. And at once, it is also queer because it embodies a certain kind of politics of representation, or politics of cultural inclusion in that sense. So that is what I'm kind of trying to draw in my argument in this paper about the simultaneity and the placement of queer spaces within broader social framework.
Right. Yeah, thank you. I quite like the way how you defined the normal space in Kolkata with the left front office and a biryani shop. It made me very nostalgic. Thank you very much for that. So if anyone has any other question, could you direct that?
Yes. Professor, this is Akshat. Can I just ask one question?
Please go ahead.
Okay. So the question is kind of common to all the panelists, but more specifically to Uddipta Roy, because you were discussing, the whole concept of a digital space and how that paves a way, in expression of sexuality. And I just wanted to ask you that: do you think that like, because you brought up Grindr, I'm just going to go back to that as an example and say, do you think that the digital space
I think we just lost you. Can you hear us?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can. Please go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So I was asking, do you think that these digital spaces are slowly becoming a medium of expression, or medium of safe expression of sexuality, Or do you think that these are kind of promoting false narratives that do not define the central theme of sexuality? The mic to this.
The question is addressed to me, or was it addressed to me?
Is that addressed to
No,
Uddipta or Gargi?
It was addressed to Uddipta, but as I said, it is again open to the general panel itself because the panel is discussing the idea of queer places as such.
Sure. So Uddipta, would you like to respond first, and then we can go to the other panelists maybe?
Yeah, fine. I can go on. So what I kind of started off with was also this idea that the pandemic, at least the pandemic, would entail a shrinkage of the physical space, and it would give a lot of primary importance to the virtual space. Also because the kind of general idea about moving towards a more and more technological society is a reliance on that technological medium. But what I found interestingly from most of my conversations was that there was a brilliant simultaneity between both spaces. For example, certain people were more comfortable with the virtual space, but they kind of did not ideate the virtual space is completely separate from the physical space. Certain people were also apprehensive of the virtual space because of, because it might cause a certain sense, in a certain sense, thuggery, or it might result in people catfishing you. But they were also not completely averse to the virtual space just because it, was for them was a site of catfishing and cheating them and all of that. So there was this, there, at least in the context of Calcutta, there is this, I would say, a weird simultaneity where people are actually not, being very particular about which space to prefer over the other, and the spaces are not really that hierarchized in the performance of sexuality. The reason to this probably Sir was insinuating there might be an aspect of neoliberalization as playing some part, some role in this process, but I haven't really looked at it. I would, really appreciate all of your comments, and maybe in future I could really look at that aspect as to why this is happening.
Can I have a follow-up if you don't mind?
Yes, please.
I just wanted to ask, because you brought this up, saying this kind of duality that exists between the physical space and virtual space, and somehow that some aspect of the population did think that the virtual space was more so. My question comes to the fact that, do you think that the virtual space was kind of an add-on to expression of sexuality, or do you think it can be viewed as a separate entity in itself? Or, as in, do you think that the virtual space is a parasite that is living off the perks and the perils of the physical space, or do you think that the virtual space can be viewed as a separate entity altogether?
Uddipta, would you care to comment on that, please?
Yeah. So when you kind of, say that you asked that the virtual space might be an add-on to the physical space, when you're also kind of commenting on this add-on kind of way in which virtual space kind of assists, shall I say, physical space. I also think that it also invariably creates a sense of binary as well. So what I'm talking about is actually a navigation which is operating through juxtapositions, which is operating through a sense of simultaneity, where I'm not really making clear demarcations between both of these spaces in which I'm operating. So I think that would kind of.
Right. So to understand, you're saying that there does exist. I mean, they both virtual and the physical space coexist as separate entities, and need not necessarily be viewed as an add-on of one to another.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we live in a world, don't we, Uddipta? I mean, you are more qualified than I am to comment because you're working on this. We live in a world where the real is always already virtual in a certain sense, right? So the ontological difference is sort of a little untenable now. I mean, how do you know the real ends and the virtual begins? right? We don't sort of have that division anymore in the world we live in. And whether it's utopian or dystopian or heterotopian, that's a different debate to be had. Gargi, would you like to respond to the earlier question, because that may have been directed to you as well? Aman, if you would like to comment, please go ahead as well. Equally go.
Sure. Yes, sir. It's like, I think he was asking about about the alternate narration, right? Alternate narrative that is formed through the digital space, right? So what I feel is that we all, if you see the history, we always had the mainstream heterosexual cisgender narratives available to us. So virtual space is what actually made it easy for the marginalized people to come up with their own versions, because to have a narration of your own, or to have to acquire visibility in the print form, or in the television form, or whatever it is, you need certain kind of privilege. But for virtual space, it is easier. I am not telling that you don't need to have any privileges. Definitely digital privilege matters, but still, comparatively, it is easy. It is easier to create your own narrative in a digital space, if you have a phone with you. Like, if you have the privilege to have your own, it will be easy.
Right. Right.
And
So my
yeah, so what I feel is like, there are certain limitations for this virtual space, because it is always owned to by the corporates, like Facebooks or YouTubes. And also, anytime the data may get distracted, just like how it happened with Orkut. So there are certain limitations, but still medium might change. But I think it is very important to have a virtual space for creating your own space within that. Yeah, that I think I would I would privilege virtual space than the
right.
material space there, in terms of self expression. Yes, there are
Right.
also, I understand that there are mainstream narratives coming out of these spaces, but equally equally you have your own space there. Like, at least you have an opportunity, but definitely there are limitations. But yeah, uh, does that answer your question?
Yes, it definitely does. But okay, I don't want to take up your time. But Professor, do you think I can just ask one question from what Gargi said? Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. Yes.
Okay. So Gargi, when you were talking this, there is this idea that struck me that I'm just trying to go back to. I think you said something along the lines that the digital space, the virtual space, is more of an easier way of expression and communication. My point of my first question was the fact that, do you think that there's a larger unhealthy narrative in the virtual space that is very easy to give in as compared to the actual narrative in the physical space? Because what we understand, because I'm someone who has been actually working on this whole idea of how the LGBTQ community is expressing itself on the virtual space. And something, I mean, I'm basically like a novice in this whole thing, but I'm trying to understand. And from what from the limited knowledge that I have, it seems to be that there is a larger unhealthy narrative, glorifying um, the glorifying the whole hookup culture, if I may say so. So, do you think that this is a safe space in? So, my question was that: do you think that the virtual space has a safe space for sexual or sexuality expression, or do you think that there's a larger narrative that people are giving into in the virtual space?
Yeah, that's what there is a scope for, as I have mentioned in my paper. uh, the dominant narratives have all, they have always tried to, create jokes on transgender bodies, and, offensive comments on them. And they have tried to frame the bodies of transgenders in certain way. But always, if it is in cyberspace, there is also an opportunity to debate it or dissent it. So that right to react or respond against this mainstream narratives, that space is available online, I guess. Like, that is an advantage. Definitely there are, definitely such dominant narratives will be keeping, it will keep on framing. But, the space to dissent is more important, I guess.
Right, we
Right.
almost
Okay.
have time.
Thank you.
So could we quickly have Aman's respond to that in terms of how do you locate this debate between real and virtual spaces, apropos of your research?
Thank you, sir. Um, so, what I feel is that something which Gargi mentioned was that how it is slightly perhaps easier to represent oneself in a virtual space than in a physical space. I think like simultaneously to that, I feel it is a lot easier to echo power relations or to reproduce power relations within virtual spaces as they are. Like it's easier to reappropriate that within virtual spaces as it is from their reproducibility in physical spaces, because I mean in my paper I talk about the reproducibility of desire, right, and the gay subject's inescapability from that kind of reproducibility. I find that that kind of reproducibility is much more easy to perform in a virtual space because um, it's right there at the click of a button, right, where you can perform any kind of exclusionary politics and garb that under a veiled sort of idea of preferences. For example, a lot of men on their bios on these dating apps, for example, like Grindr, would put in their bios what are the kind of men that they don't want to date, or what are the kind of men that they don't want to see. And that includes every kind of exclusionary politics, from gender, from sexuality, class, caste, religion also. People write specifically on their bio that they don't want to date somebody who is from the Islamic faith, or they don't want to date somebody who is feminine. So, I mean, that kind of much more easy reproducibility of power relations does kind of and for example, the person who put the question also said that the insistence on hookup culture and this kind of exaggerative politicization of the actual act of engaging in sex as a kind of anti-patriarchal politics. It creates these sort of essentialities for everybody else to follow, and then in this kind of sexual liberation politics, the choice of perhaps the very valid choice of not wanting to engage in this reproducible manifestation of sexuality is then considered not liberal enough, or not queer enough, or not not anti-patriarchal enough. So this kind of these virtualities do create, I agree with the person who put the question, that these do create a kind of false narrative. I mean, I wouldn't call it a false narrative, but I would rather call it a much more easier extension of what actually goes down in the physical space. Yeah.
Right, excellent. I think we're almost out of time now. We are out of time. We're 3 minutes having overshot the time limit. But thank you again, all three of you, for a fascinating panel. I just like to conclude with one concept which I think can be applied to all your papers. And I'm sure most of you are aware of it. It's the concept of chrononormativity, right? Chrononormativity. So whenever you talk about space and gender, we can't just sort of speak of space alone. Space is always already temporal in quality, right? And especially when it comes to a certain kind of temporality, and chrononormativity is a concept used by Adela Friedman, which talks about the hegemonic idea of time, which is very gendered in quality. And how do you locate the alternative sexualities outside that temporality, right? And of course, temporality and spatiality, as all of you would agree, are connected categories. Whether it's virtual space or real space, is always temporal in quality. You log in, you log out, right? There is a sort of spasmodic temporal mutability about our engagement and consumption of space, which is temporal. So I think chrononormativity, or the normative understanding of time, and how do you locate certain identities outside of that identity, outside of that temporality, could be a useful concept that can be applied to all three of your papers. But thank you again for what has been really stimulating and interesting panel. I've learned a lot from each one of your papers, and I look forward to engaging with you personally or informally in the times to come. So, and good luck with your research ahead.